I still remember the moment I realized my marriage was over. Not because of the drama that followed, but because of how ordinary it felt. After 30 years of marriage, Richard didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye when he told me. He was packing for what I thought was another business trip, methodically folding his designer shirts into a suitcase while casually mentioning that he wouldn't be coming back. 3 decades of my life, dismissed between the folding of a Brooks Brothers shirt and the careful arrangement of his cufflinks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marlo, we need to talk about something, he said, his eyes focused on his luggage. This isn't working for me anymore. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I need to move on. I stood in the doorway of our master bedroom, the one I had meticulously decorated over the years, feeling as if the air had been sucked from my lungs. 30 years of organizing his life, hosting his business dinners, playing the perfect wife at every charity gala in Lakeside, and he couldn't even pause his packing to end our marriage. Is there someone else? I asked, already knowing the answer. A man like Richard Mitchell doesn't leave without a safety net. He finally looked up, not with guilt, but with something worse. Relief. Yes. I didn't want it to happen this way, but these things, they just happen sometimes. These things just happen, I repeated, my voice hollow. Who is she? The pause that followed stretched for an eternity, filling our bedroom with a silence so heavy it seemed to press against my skin. It's Vanessa. My sister. My younger sister. I met Richard at 22, fresh out of college with an art history degree and dreams that extended far beyond the borders of my hometown. He was 15 years older, established, confident. Everything that seemed impressive to a young woman who'd grown up in a middle-class neighborhood dreaming of something more. Richard spotted me at a gallery opening where I was working as an assistant. I remember the way he walked directly toward me, ignoring the actual artist whose work was being featured. He had that effect, making you feel like the only person in a crowded room. You don't belong here, he said, gesturing around. The modest gallery. I raised an eyebrow, already annoyed by his presumption. Excuse me? This place is beneath someone with your eye. He nodded toward a particular painting I had been admiring earlier. You stopped at the only piece in this collection worth looking at. You have taste that's being wasted in this place. It was a line, of course. I realized that much later. But at 22, it felt like recognition, like someone finally seeing the potential I always believed I had. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Private jets to weekend getaways, dinners at restaurants where the menus had no prices, front row seats at fashion shows in New York. Richard didn't just introduce me to luxury, he introduced me to a world where everything seemed possible. When he proposed 6 months later with a diamond ring that felt heavier than my entire future, my parents were concerned about the speed, the age difference, the fundamental change in lifestyle. You barely know him, my mother warned, her eyes fixed on the enormous diamond that now weighed down my left hand. I know enough, I insisted, drunk on the possibilities Richard represented. My sister Vanessa had just turned 18 then. While I had always been the responsible one, the planner, Vanessa was all impulse and charm. She flitted between interests and boyfriends with equal casualness, never quite finding her footing. When she met Richard at our engagement dinner, I noticed how she straightened her posture, how her laugh became more deliberate. I noticed, but I dismissed it. She was young, impressed by wealth as most teenagers would be, and Richard was marrying me. The prenuptial agreement came as no surprise. Richard was already worth millions, his investment firm growing steadily year after year. What did surprise me was his attorney's insistence on certain clauses that seemed oddly specific. In the event of infidelity on Mr. Mitchell's part, Martin Goldstein explained, sliding the document across the table, particularly if it involves a family member of Ms. Reeves, all confidentiality clauses become null and void, and Ms. Reeves retains ownership of the properties listed in Appendix C. I looked up, confused. That's oddly specific. Richard chuckled, placing his hand over mine. Marlo, it's just legal language. They have to cover all possibilities, no matter how ridiculous. Who writes a prenup thinking about things that would never happen? I signed without further question. When you're 22 and in love with the idea of a perfect future, you don't imagine that the prenup you're signing will become your salvation 30 years later. The early years of our marriage were everything I'd imagined. Richard's business flourished, and I embraced my role as the elegant, cultured wife of a successful man. I organized dinner parties that helped him secure deals, chose artwork that made our home impressive to his clients, wore designers that reflected his success. If sometimes I felt more like an accessory than a partner, I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the lifestyle we were building. Vanessa drifted in and out of our lives during those years. She would appear when she needed money or connections, stayed just long enough to charm Richard into helping her with whatever her latest crisis was, then disappear again. I welcomed these visits at first, glad to maintain a connection with my sister despite our different paths. If I occasionally felt a flicker of unease at how she looked at Richard, I ignored it. She was family, after all, and family meant trust. As the years passed, I gradually set aside my own ambitions. The gallery I had once dreamed of opening remained just that, a dream. Instead, I became the perfect corporate wife, my identity, so thoroughly entwined with Richard's that I could no longer see where he ended and I began. "Don't you ever want something that's just yours?" Diane asked me once over lunch. She was my oldest friend, the only one who still spoke to me with complete honesty. "I have everything I need," I replied automatically, the answer I'd rehearsed over years of similar questions. Diane looked at me skeptically. "That's not what I asked, Marlo." I changed the subject. Some truths were too uncomfortable to examine in the harsh light of a restaurant lunch. By our 25th anniversary, I had perfected the role of Mrs. Richard Mitchell. I knew which wines paired best with which client personalities, could discuss market trends just enough to seem intelligent without threatening masculine egos, could deflect questions about children with a practiced smile that revealed nothing of the 3 miscarriages that had left me hollow in the early years of our marriage. The party Richard threw for our anniversary was spectacular, a testament to his success rather than our love, though I didn't allow myself to acknowledge that distinction. 200 guests in the ballroom of the Lakeside Country Club, Champaign, flowing freely, a band playing songs that charted the decades of our marriage. I wore a gown that cost more than my parents' first house and smiled until my face ached. "You've done well for yourself," my father said during a rare quiet moment. He had never quite warmed to Richard, maintaining a polite distance that I attributed to class differences rather than instinct. "We've built a good life," I corrected gently. He studied me for a moment. "Is it the life you wanted, Marlo?" Before I could answer, Richard appeared, placing a proprietary hand on my waist. "There's my beautiful wife. Senator Williams is asking for you. Apparently you made quite an impression at the charity auction last month." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And just like that, I was whisked away, the question left hanging in the air between my father and me. 5 more years passed in a blur of sameness. I maintained our homes, managed our social calendar, accompanied Richard on business trips, where I was expected to charm and distract the wives of his associates. If I felt increasingly invisible, I told myself it was the natural progression of a long marriage, comfort replacing passion, routine replacing surprise. I didn't notice when things began to change. Perhaps because the changes were so subtle, or perhaps because I had become so accustomed to not looking too closely at the cracks in our perfect facade. Richard began working later, traveling more frequently, checking his phone with a guarded expression I hadn't seen before. And Vanessa began visiting more often, usually when Richard was home rather than during the weekdays when I would have welcomed the company. At 48, she had the same restless energy as always, bouncing between careers and relationships with no clear direction. Yet somehow she had maintained the vitality that I felt draining from me with each passing year. "You're so lucky. Marlo," she would say, gesturing around our lakeside mansion. "All this security, this stability. You've always known exactly what you wanted." I would smile and nod, not admitting that I couldn't remember the last time I had wanted anything for myself, that I had become so adept at anticipating Richard's desires that my own had atrophied from neglect. It was during one of Vanessa's visits that I first noticed something had shifted. Nothing obvious, just a new awareness between them, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, a tension in the air that hadn't existed before. I dismissed my concerns as paranoia, the insecurity of a woman watching her 50s approach while married to a man who still turned heads. "You're imagining things," I told myself firmly after catching a look between them during dinner one evening. "She's your sister, he's your husband. There are lines people don't cross." But some lines, I would soon learn, were not just crossed, but erased entirely. The day Richard told me he was leaving began like any other. I rose early, swam my usual laps in our pool, prepared his favorite breakfast even though he rarely had time to eat it. When he mentioned a business trip to Naples, I thought nothing of it. He traveled to Florida frequently to check on our vacation property and meet with clients who wintered there. It wasn't until I saw him packing his favorite casual clothes, rather than his usual business attire, that a cold weight settled in my stomach. "Taking some personal time after the meetings?" I asked, working to keep my tone light. "Something like that," he answered without looking up. And then came the conversation that ended 30 years of marriage, the admission that it was Vanessa he was leaving with, my sister. The prenup's oddly specific clause suddenly making perfect, terrible sense. I didn't cry when he left. I sat on the edge of our bed, my bed now, I supposed, and felt strangely calm. 3 decades of my life had just imploded, and yet I felt nothing but a curious sense of clarity, as if I were seeing everything in focus for the first time in years. The phone call came 3 hours later. "Marlo, it's me." Vanessa's voice, tentative in a way I'd never heard before. "I think we need to talk." "I don't think we do," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Please, this isn't." "It isn't what you think. Rich and we didn't mean for this to happen. We've been fighting it for years." Years. The word echoed in my mind, unlocking memories I had deliberately misinterpreted. The long weekend visits, the private jokes, the way they both seemed more animated in each other's presence than in mine. "How generous of you both to fight so hard," I said, the first edge of anger finally breaking through the numbness. "We never wanted to hurt you," she continued, as if reading from a script of things adulterers always say. "But don't you want us to be happy? After all this time, don't we deserve a chance at real love?" The question was so breathtakingly selfish that it startled a laugh from me. Real love, as opposed to the fake love of honoring commitments and respecting boundaries? That's not fair, Marlo. People change. Feelings change. "Yes," I agreed quietly. "I'm discovering that myself. Right now." I hung up before she could respond and sat motionless as the sun set outside my window, casting long shadows across the room that Richard and I had shared for decades. This house that had never quite felt like mine despite the years I'd spent perfecting it. This life that had slowly consumed whatever dreams I'd once had for myself. The next morning I called Martin Goldstein's office. "I need to review my prenuptial agreement," I told his secretary, specifically the clauses regarding infidelity with a family member. There was a pause. "I'll connect you immediately, Mrs. Mitchell." Martin remembered the clause in question without having to review the document. I always wondered about that one, he admitted after confirming its contents. It was unusually specific, and Mr. Mitchell's attorney objected quite strongly before eventually conceding. I'd like to invoke it, I said, my decision made sometime during the sleepless night. All of it. You understand what that means? Martin asked carefully. Once the confidentiality clauses are lifted, all financial arrangements from your marriage become public record. Every investment, every property transfer, it will all be available for scrutiny. I understand perfectly, I replied, thinking of Richard's carefully cultivated image, the business relationships built on discretion and trust. That's exactly what I want. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Richard, upon learning of my intentions, alternated between rage and desperate negotiation. Be reasonable, Marlowe, he urged during a tense meeting in Martin's office. Think about what you're doing. 30 years together means something. We can end this with dignity. Dignity, I repeated, looking at him clearly for perhaps the first time in our marriage. You left me for my sister after 30 years, and now you're concerned about dignity. His attorney, Patricia Hernandez, interjected. Mrs. Mitchell, my client is prepared to offer a very generous settlement. The Naples property, a significant cash payment, ongoing support, all without the need for public disclosure. I smiled, feeling a strange power flowing through me. That's very thoughtful, but I'm not interested in negotiating. This vindictiveness isn't like you, Richard said, frustration edging his voice. You're right, I agreed. It isn't like the me you knew, but I'm discovering I'm not that person anymore. I left the meeting without looking back, ignoring Richard's calls and texts over the following days. Let him worry. Let him wonder what would happen when our financial arrangements became public knowledge. Let him explain to his clients, his business partners, his social circle why certain investments had been structured the way they were, why certain properties had changed hands with suspicious timing relative to market shifts. The information was released as specified in the prenup. Within days, business publications were running stories analyzing Richard's financial patterns over the decades. Questions were being raised about certain clients' remarkable returns. Regulatory bodies were expressing interest in reviewing past transactions. Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble at the edges. Not because he had done anything explicitly illegal. Richard was too careful for that. But because the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging in the financial world as actual misconduct. Clients began withdrawing their business. Invitations to sit on boards were rescinded. The whispers at the country club grew louder. You've destroyed everything, he accused during an unexpected visit to the house we had shared. He looked older. Suddenly, the confident man who had dismissed 30 years of marriage now reduced to someone desperate and uncertain. No, Richard, I corrected calmly. I simply revealed the truth. You did the rest yourself. And what about you? He demanded. You've exposed our entire life. Your life, too. I considered this. Yes, I suppose I have. But unlike you, I find I don't mind starting over. It was true, I realized as I said it. The prospect of rebuilding at 52 should have terrified me, but instead, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The prenup had secured me financially, the house in Lakeside, the beach property in Naples, and enough investments to ensure I would never need to worry about money. But more importantly, it had freed me from the golden cage I had willingly entered at 22. 3 months after Richard left, I sold the Lakeside mansion. The memories it held were not ones I wished to preserve. I kept only my personal belongings, artwork I had genuinely loved rather than purchased for status, and photographs from the time before Richard, when my dreams had been wholly my own. I moved to Seattle, a city as far from Lakeside as I could reasonably go while staying within the country. I rented a modest apartment overlooking the water and for the first time in 30 years, lived alone. The silence was deafening at first, then gradually comforting, and finally, exhilarating. No meals to plan around someone else's preferences, no social obligations to fulfill, no identity to maintain other than the one I was slowly rediscovering. I enrolled in classes at a local university, studying art history again, reconnecting with the passion I had abandoned decades ago. My classmates were mostly young enough to be my children, but I found I didn't mind. Their perspectives were refreshing. Their acceptance of me as simply Marlowe rather than Mrs. Richard Mitchell, surprisingly validating. When I finally felt ready, I used some of my settlement money to lease a small space in Pike Place Market. The gallery I had once dreamed of became reality at last, modest compared to the luxury I had grown accustomed to, but entirely, wonderfully, mine. I named it New Beginnings. The opening night was small by lakeside standards, just a few dozen people, mostly local artists whose work I had decided to feature, along with some classmates and new friends. No champagne and crystal flutes, no society photographers documenting who attended, no ulterior motives behind each conversation. Just art, honest appreciation, and a sense of possibility that filled the space. Diane flew in from Chicago for the YAF occasion, the one connection to my past life I had maintained. "Look at you," she said, embracing me tightly. "You're glowing." I laughed. "I'm exhausted. Opening a business is harder than I remembered." "That's not what I mean." As she stepped back, studying me. "You look like yourself again, the Marlowe I knew before Richard." I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. The woman who had been Mrs. Richard Mitchell, perfectly groomed, unfailingly appropriate, carefully controlled, had gradually faded away. In her place was someone with paint-stained fingers from helping hang the exhibits, laugh lines from genuine smiles rather than practiced social expressions, a wardrobe chosen for comfort and personal taste rather than status. I never thought. "I'd say this," I admitted, "but losing everything turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." Diane squeezed my hand. "You didn't lose everything, Marlowe. You just shed what wasn't really yours to begin with." Later that evening, as the last guest departed and I locked up my gallery, for the first time, my phone chimed with a text message. I almost didn't check it, suspecting it might be Richard again. He had taken to sending occasional messages that veered between accusation and nostalgia, neither of which interested me anymore. But it wasn't Richard. It was Vanessa. "I heard about your gallery opening. Congratulations. I always knew you had it in you. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for everything. R and I didn't last. Turns out we had nothing in common except betraying you. I miss my sister." I stared at the message for a long time, watching the 3 pulsing dots that indicated she was typing more, then stopping, then typing again. Finally, they disappeared, leaving just her words hanging between us. Did I miss my sister? The question was more complicated than it should have been. The betrayal still stung, but increasingly, I recognized that both Richard and Vanessa had done me a perverse favor. Without their actions, I might have continued in that half-life indefinitely, never rediscovering what it meant to truly live as myself. I put the phone away without responding. There would be time to decide about Vanessa later. Tonight was about celebrating my new beginning, not revisiting the end that had made it possible. As I walked along the waterfront toward my apartment, I realized that the prenup Richard had insisted upon, the document designed to protect his wealth from me, had instead protected me from losing myself entirely. The strange specific clause about family members had been my unexpected salvation, allowing me not just financial security, but the leverage to break free completely. I wondered if the young woman I had been at 22, signing that document, with stars in her eyes, could have imagined this outcome. Probably not. She had been too dazzled by the promise of the life Richard offered, too certain that love would be enough, too willing to set aside her own dreams for someone else's. But that young woman had been wiser than she knew. She had signed the document. That would eventually set her free, even if it took 30 years to use it. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't anger or revenge. It's simply reclaiming the self you set aside for someone else's convenience. Richard had walked away expecting me to crumble, to beg, to accept whatever terms he offered just to maintain some fraction of the life we had built. Vanessa had expected forgiveness without accountability, as she had received all her life. Neither of them had anticipated that I might choose myself instead. I stopped at the water's edge, watching the lights of the city reflect on the dark surface. 52 years old, starting over in a new city, surrounded by new people, pursuing old dreams with renewed passion. Not the life I had planned, but perhaps the one I had always needed. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air and smiled. The prenup had given me the means to escape, but I had found the courage to walk away all on my own. And that, I was discovering, made all the difference. The first sign that something was truly wrong came 6 months before Richard's confession. We were hosting our annual summer gala, an event that had become something of a tradition among Chicago's financial elite. I had spent weeks perfecting every detail, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the specially imported flowers that matched the exact shade of blue in our home's color scheme. Richard had always appreciated these touches, understanding that the impression we made on his clients and colleagues translated directly to his business success. That evening, I wore a gown I had commissioned from a designer Richard favored, my hair and makeup professionally done as always. I moved through our lakeside mansion with practiced ease, greeting guests, ensuring champagne flutes remained filled, gently steering conversations to highlight Richard's recent business triumphs. It was a role I had perfected over 3 decades, the elegant, accomplished wife who made everything appear effortless. "Marlo, darling, you've outdone yourself again," Thomas Reynolds, Richard's oldest business partner, commented as I refreshed his drink. "Richard doesn't know how lucky he is." I offered the polite smile I had perfected for such comments. "I'm the lucky one, Tom. Always have been." It was the expected response, one I had given hundreds of times over the years. The script never varied. They complimented, I deflected. Everyone maintained the comfortable fiction that our lives were as perfect as they appeared. I spotted Richard across the room, deep in conversation with a potential investor. He caught my eye and gave me our signal, a slight tilt of his champagne glass that meant he needed me to come rescue him in exactly 10 minutes, enough time to seem interested, but not so long that he would be trapped. 30 years of marriage had given us an entire language of subtle cues and signals, allowing us to navigate social situations with precision. But when I approached him precisely 10 minutes later, something was off. Richard didn't introduce me with his usual flair, didn't rest his hand at the small of my back in the possessive gesture I had grown accustomed to. Instead, he seemed almost irritated by my arrival. "The Hendersons were just telling me about their summer plans," he said, his tone carrying an edge I rarely heard in public. "Perhaps you could check on the caterers. I think they're running low on the shrimp appetizer." I masked my confusion with a practiced smile. "Of course, lovely to meet you both." As I walked away, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of our carefully choreographed life. Richard had never dismissed me so obviously before. Our partnership, and it was a partnership, even if the terms had always been dictated by his needs, had been built on mutual understanding of our roles. I provided the perfect backdrop for his success. He provided the lifestyle I had grown accustomed to. For him to disrupt that balance in public was unprecedented. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the catering staff had cleaned up, I found Richard in his study, already changed out of his tuxedo and into the casual clothes he preferred when no one was watching. "Is everything all right?" I asked, still wearing my evening gown. too tired to go through the lengthy process of removing it without assistance. You seemed distracted tonight. Richard didn't look up from his laptop. Just business on my mind. The Henderson account is proving more complicated than anticipated. It was a plausible explanation, but something in his tone didn't ring true. After 30 years, I could distinguish between Richard's genuine business concerns and his excuses. This was definitely the latter. You could have introduced me instead of sending me away, I said carefully. Mrs. Henderson mentioned they just redecorated their Lake Geneva house. We could have connected on that. Richard finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Not everything is about making social connections, Marlo. Sometimes business is just business. The rebuke stung more than it should have. Making social connections was precisely what Richard had valued about me for 3 decades. My ability to charm, to remember personal details, to create environments where people felt important. These had been my primary contributions to our marriage. For him to dismiss those skills now felt like more than just a momentary irritation. Of course, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I'm going to bed. Don't stay up too late. He was already looking back at his screen. I'll be up a while. Don't wait for me. That night marked the first of many small changes. Richard began working later, traveling more frequently, attending events without me that had always been our engagements. When he was home, he was distant, his attention constantly pulled to his phone, smiling at text messages from someone he never identified. I told myself it was just a phase, a midlife crisis perhaps, though Richard was well past the age when such things typically occurred. At 67, he was still remarkably handsome, his silver hair and fit physique the result of expensive tailoring and a personal trainer I had insisted on years ago. Men in his position often went through periods of restlessness, I reasoned. It would pass. But it didn't pass. If anything, the distance between us grew wider. Our conversations became perfunctory, limited to household logistics and social obligations. The casual intimacies of long marriage, the morning coffee shared, in comfortable silence, the debriefs after social events, the small physical touchpoints that had punctuated our days, gradually disappeared, leaving a hollow space where our connection had been. Have you and Richard considered couples therapy? Diane asked during one of our monthly lunches. You seem different lately. I stirred my untouched salad. Richard doesn't believe in therapy. He says it's for people who lack self-discipline. Diane's expression softened with concern. And what do you believe, Marlo? The question caught me off guard. What did I believe? After 30 years of calibrating my opinions to complement Richard's, I wasn't entirely sure anymore. I believe marriages go through phases, I said finally. This is just a temporary adjustment period. Diane reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Just remember you deserve happiness too. Not just Richard. Her words stayed with me, an uncomfortable pebble in the shoe of my carefully constructed life. Happiness had never been the point, not really. I had traded that possibility for security, status, and a certain kind of freedom that came with wealth. Richard and I had an arrangement that had worked for 30 years. If the terms were changing, I needed to adapt, not question the foundation. Then Vanessa called, asking if she could stay with us for a while. She had just ended another relationship, was between apartments, needed some time to regroup. It was a familiar pattern. My sister's life had always been a series of fresh starts and sudden endings, each crisis requiring family intervention and financial support. Of course you can stay, I told her without consulting Richard. Family was family, and our guest room stood empty most of the time anyway. Take as long as you need. When I informed Richard of Vanessa's imminent arrival, I expected his usual resigned sigh. My sister had never been his favorite person, though he had always been generous with her out of respect for me. Instead, he surprised me with his response. Actually, that works out perfectly, he said, looking up from his newspaper with unusual animation. I could use her help with a project I'm working on. A project? I echoed, confused. What kind of project would Vanessa help with? Richard shrugged, returning to his paper. Just some ideas for revamping our charitable foundation. Vanessa has experience in nonprofit work, doesn't she? It was true that Vanessa had briefly worked for a community arts program, one of her many short-lived career attempts. But Richard had never shown the slightest interest in her professional experiences before. That's thoughtful of you, I said carefully. I'm sure she'd be happy to contribute. Vanessa arrived 3 days later with her usual excess of luggage and energy, filling our quiet home with chatter and the scent of the expensive perfume she always wore too much of. I had prepared the guest suite furthest from our bedroom, knowing her habit of playing music late into the night. This place never changes, she declared, dropping her bags in the foyer for the housekeeper to deal with. Same perfect furniture, same perfect art, same perfect sister. I embraced her, noting that at 48, she still maintained the slim figure and vibrant presence that had always drawn attention. While time had softened my edges, adding weight to my hips and lines around my eyes, Vanessa seemed to exist in a perpetual state of youthful energy. Not everything has to change to have value, I replied mildly. How long do you think you'll stay this time? She shrugged, already moving through the house with the familiarity of someone who had visited frequently. Not sure. The last relationship really did a number on me. I might need some serious recovery time. I followed her, watching as she ran her hand along the marble countertop in the kitchen. Well, you're welcome as long as you need. Richard mentioned he might have some work for you with our foundation. At Richard's name, a subtle change came over her expression, a quickening of interest, a brightness in her eyes that seemed disproportionate to the mention of charitable work. Richard's home? She asked, glancing toward his study. I should say hello. He'll be back around 6, I said, puzzled by her eagerness. He's playing golf with clients today. Vanessa nodded, her enthusiasm dimming slightly. Of course he is, always working, that man. How do you stand it after all these years? The question carried an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. Marriage is about understanding each other's priorities, I answered, the response automatic after years of similar inquiries. Richard's work is important to him. She gave me a look I couldn't interpret. And what's important to you, Marlowe? After all this time being Richard Mitchell's wife, what do you want for yourself? It was the second time in recent weeks someone had asked me a version of that question, and I found myself equally unprepared to answer it. What did I want? The question seemed almost irrelevant after 3 decades of arranging my desires to complement Richard's. I have everything I need, I said finally. Vanessa's expression softened with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. That's not what I asked. When Richard returned home that evening, the dynamic in the house shifted immediately. He entered with unusual energy, calling out greetings as he came through the door rather than retreating directly to his study as had become his habit. Vanessa! He exclaimed, his voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard in months. Welcome back to our home. I watched from the kitchen as they embraced, noting how Richard's hand lingered at my sister's waist slightly longer than strictly necessary. There was an ease between them that struck me as odd, given their historically polite but distant relationship. Richard, you haven't aged a day, Vanessa laughed, patting his chest familiarly. What's your secret? Good genes and a better wife, he replied automatically, but his eyes didn't seek me out as they once would have when making such a comment. Dinner that night was strangely animated. Richard, who had grown increasingly silent during our meals, together suddenly had endless questions for Vanessa about her travels, her work experiences, her opinions on everything from politics to wine. He laughed at her stories, leaned forward when she spoke, refilled her glass with attentive precision. I sat at my usual place at the head of the table, feeling increasingly like a spectator rather than a participant. The conversation flowed around me, occasionally including me in ways that felt perfunctory rather than genuine. I found myself studying them both with a detachment that surprised me, noting the mirrored body language, the inside jokes that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, the charged energy that filled the spaces between their words. "Marlo tells me you might have some work for me," Vanessa said as we moved to the living room after dinner. "Something with your foundation." Richard nodded, settling beside her on the sofa rather than in his usual armchair. "We're launching a new arts initiative. Given your background, I thought you might have valuable input." "My background?" Vanessa laughed. "You mean that community arts center job I had for 6 months? You have a natural instinct for what appeals to people," Richard insisted. "That's not something you can teach." The compliment hung in the air, weighted with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I excused myself to make coffee, needing a moment alone to process the discomfort creeping through me. In the kitchen, I gripped the edge of the counter, forcing myself to breathe slowly. What was happening here? Was I imagining the undercurrent between my husband and sister, projecting my insecurities onto innocent interactions? Or was I finally seeing something that had been developing right under my nose? When I returned with the coffee tray, they were sitting closer together, Richard showing Vanessa something on his phone that made her laugh. They separated slightly when I entered, Richard clearing his throat and Vanessa suddenly very interested in straightening her blouse. "Coffee?" I offered, keeping my voice steady. The weeks that followed established a new routine in our home. Richard, who had been leaving for the office before I woke and returning after I was in bed, suddenly began working from home several days a week. He and Vanessa spent hours in his study with the door closed, allegedly discussing the foundation project. Their voices would occasionally rise in laughter, then drop to murmurs too quiet for me to make out. I found myself inventing reasons to interrupt these sessions, bringing refreshments, asking unnecessary questions about dinner preferences, accidentally needing documents from Richard's desk. Each time I was met with the same tableau. Richard and Vanessa seated on the same side of his desk, papers spread between them, an intimacy in their posture that seemed at odds with professional collaboration. "How is the project coming along?" I asked one evening as Richard and I prepared for bed, a ritual that had become increasingly silent in recent months. "Well," he replied vaguely, focused on his phone. "Vanessa has some interesting perspectives." "I'm sure she does," I said, watching his reflection in the bathroom mirror as I removed my makeup. "She's always been creative." Richard made a non-committal sound, his attention never leaving his screen. I noticed he had angled himself away from me, protecting whatever he was reading from my line of sight. "You've been working together a lot," I continued, keeping my tone casual. "I hardly see either of you anymore." This finally made him look up. "Are you feeling neglected, Marlo?" The question carried a hint of mockery that cut deeper than outright criticism would have. "Not neglected," I said carefully. "Just curious about the project that's consuming so much of your attention." Richard set his phone down with deliberate care. "The foundation is important to me. You know that." "Of course," I agreed. "I just find it interesting that after years of handling the foundation work myself, you've suddenly developed such a passionate interest in its operations." A flash of something, guilt, irritation, crossed his face before his expression settled into the bland pleasantness he used with difficult clients. "People change, Marlo. Priorities shift. Isn't that natural after 30 years? The statement hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us was willing to articulate. I finished my nightly routine in silence, sliding into bed beside the man who had been my husband for 3 decades, feeling the vast expanse of cold sheets between us. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself wandering downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed the guest wing, I noticed a sliver of light beneath Vanessa's door. Without conscious decision, I found myself moving closer, ears straining for any sound. For a moment, all was silent, and I felt foolish standing there in my nightgown, spying like a suspicious housemaid. Then I heard it. Richard's distinctive laugh, muffled but unmistakable, coming from inside my sister's room. I froze, hand half raised as if to knock, then slowly lowered it. What would I say? What could I possibly ask that wouldn't make me sound exactly like what I was? A wife suspecting her husband of infidelity with her own sister. The absurdity of the situation struck me suddenly, drawing a silent, bitter laugh from my throat. Instead of confronting them, I returned to my bedroom and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and wondering when exactly my carefully constructed life had begun its silent collapse. Had it been happening for years without my noticing? Or was this truly something new, a sudden deviation rather than a slow drift? The next morning, I called Martin Goldstein's office and requested a copy of our prenuptial agreement. If my suspicions were correct, I needed to know exactly where I stood legally. It had been 30 years since I'd signed that document, a young woman dazzled by the prospect of marrying into wealth and prominence. I remembered very little of its contents beyond the general provisions for financial separation. Mrs. Mitchell. Martin's secretary sounded surprised. It's been some time. I'll have those documents sent over this afternoon. Is there anything specific you're looking for? Just doing some estate planning. I lied smoothly. Nothing urgent. The prenup arrived via courier 3 hours later, a thick envelope marked confidential. I took it to my private sitting room, the one space in the house that remained, exclusively mine, and began reading. Most of it was standard legal language, definitions of separate property, provisions for death or divorce, protections for Richard's business interests. But midway through, I found the clause that made my hands tremble as I read it. In the event of infidelity on Mr. Mitchell's part, particularly if it involves a family member of Ms. Reeves, all confidentiality clauses become null and void, and Ms. Reeves retains ownership of the properties listed in Appendix C, as well as 25% interest in Mitchell Investments. I read the paragraph 3 times, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. Why would such a specific provision exist unless Richard had been contemplating this very scenario even before we married? The implications were staggering. Had he been involved with Vanessa even then, when she was barely 18? Or was he simply covering all possible contingencies, the way he did in his business dealings? Appendix C listed properties that had grown substantially over the years: our vacation home in Naples, a small apartment building in Chicago that generated significant rental income, and most surprisingly, the building that housed Mitchell Investments headquarters, which Richard had purchased early in our marriage as a long-term investment strategy. If this clause were triggered, I would effectively control a significant portion of Richard's business operations, not just receive a settlement. It was more than financial protection. It was leverage. I carefully replaced the document in its envelope, my mind racing. The question wasn't just whether Richard and Vanessa were having an affair. The late-night conversations, the lingering touches, Richard's presence in her room made that increasingly clear. The question was what I intended to do about it. For the first time in our marriage, I held information Richard didn't know I possessed. Knowledge that could potentially upend the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 decades. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, I watched them with new awareness. The casual way Richard's hand brushed Vanessa's as they passed dishes at dinner. The private smiles they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. The way conversations stopped abruptly when I entered a room. It was all so obvious now that I had allowed myself to see it. I excused myself early, claiming a headache, and retreated to my bedroom. Through the closed door, I heard them move to the living room, music playing softly, glasses clinking as they poured drinks. I should have felt devastated, betrayed, heartbroken. Instead, I felt oddly calm, as if watching a play unfold from a comfortable distance. The next morning, I called Diane. "I need to ask you something," I said when she answered. "And I need you to be completely honest." "Always," she replied, concern evident in her voice. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath. "How long have Richard and Vanessa been seeing each other?" The silence that followed told me everything. Diane had never been good at hiding things from me, which was why I had called her rather than confronting Richard or Vanessa directly. "Marlo," she finally said, her voice gentle. "How did you find out?" "So it's true," I said flatly. "How long have you known?" She sighed heavily. "I've had suspicions for about a year. Nothing concrete until about 6 months ago, when I saw them together at that new restaurant on Michigan Avenue. They didn't see me. A year, possibly longer. While I had been planning our anniversary celebration, managing our social calendar, maintaining the perfect home, my husband and sister had been conducting an affair right under my nose. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I wasn't certain at first," Diane said. And then, "Marlo, you've built your entire life around Richard. I was afraid of what it would do to you." "What it would do to me," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "As opposed to what they were already doing to me without my knowledge." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you. I just didn't know how." After hanging up, I sat motionless in my sitting room, staring out at the manicured gardens I had designed years ago. Everything in this house, on these grounds, had been selected and arranged to create the perfect backdrop for the life Richard wanted. I had been so focused on maintaining that backdrop that I had failed to notice when I was no longer part of the main scene. A cold clarity settled over me. For 30 years, I had defined myself as Mrs. Richard Mitchell, the perfect corporate wife. I had sublimated whatever personal ambitions I once had into creating and maintaining a life that served Richard's needs and aspirations. I had done everything right, played by every rule of our unspoken agreement. And none of it had mattered. Richard and Vanessa had rewritten the script without informing me, reducing me to an unwitting supporting character in their story. I picked up the prenuptial agreement again, focusing on that oddly specific clause. The wording suggested not just foresight, but expectation. Richard had anticipated this scenario, possibly planned for it. The question was whether he remembered, including that provision after 30 years. I scheduled a lunch with Martin Goldstein for the following day, away from the house, at a restaurant where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from Richard's social circle. I needed to understand my options before making any decisions. That evening, Richard announced he would be taking Vanessa to Naples for the weekend to assess the property for potential foundation use. The lie was so transparent, so casually delivered, that I almost laughed. "That sounds like an excellent idea," I said, matching his casual tone. The property could certainly benefit from a fresh perspective. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He had clearly expected resistance, perhaps even confrontation. My easy acquiescence seemed to unsettle him more than an argument would have. "You don't want to join us?" he asked, a perfunctory offer. We both knew I would decline. "I have plans with Diane," I replied smoothly. "Take lots of pictures. I'd love to hear your ideas when you return." As I watched them drive away the next morning, expensive luggage loaded into Richard's car, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in our marriage, I was not the one being deceived. I was the one with hidden knowledge, with a plan forming slowly but deliberately. At lunch, Martin confirmed what I had already suspected. "The clause is enforceable," he said, keeping his voice low despite our private table. Quite generous, in fact. Unusual for a prenup of that era. And if I were to invoke it? I asked, sipping my water. What would that process look like? Martin studied me carefully. It would depend on your ultimate goal, Marlowe. Do you want to divorce Richard? Negotiate new terms? Simply confront him with what you know? It was a good question, one I had been pondering since discovering the affair. What did I want? Divorce seemed the obvious answer, but after 30 years, disentangling our lives would be complicated. And beyond the practical considerations, there was a deeper question I had yet to fully examine. Who was Marlowe Winters without Richard? Mitchell? I want options, I said finally. I need to understand exactly what leverage I have before deciding how to use it. Martin nodded, understanding perfectly. He had built his career advising wealthy clients on protecting their assets. The clause gives you significant leverage. If activated, not only would the confidentiality provisions be nullified, allowing all financial details to become public record, but you would gain control of key properties that Richard relies on for both income and business operations. And what would trigger the clause officially? I asked. Evidence of the infidelity with your sister would need to be documented, Martin replied. But given the specific nature of the clause, the burden of proof would be relatively low. Witness. Testimony, photographs, even hotel receipts could be sufficient. I thought of them in Naples, doubtless staying in our vacation home, making no effort to hide their relationship from the staff who had known me for years. Evidence would not be difficult to obtain. I'll need some time to consider my next steps, I told Martin as our lunch concluded. But I'd like you to be prepared to move quickly when I decide. He squeezed my hand gently. For what it's worth, Marlowe, you deserve better than this. You've been an exemplary wife to Richard for 30 years. His actions reflect on him, not you. The words were kind, but they struck an uncomfortable chord. Had I truly been an exemplary wife? Or had I simply been exactly what Richard wanted, until he wanted something else? Had I surrendered so much of myself to this marriage that there was nothing left but the role I played? As I drove home, these questions circled in my mind. The house felt eerily quiet without Richard and Vanessa's presence. I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The artwork chosen to impress Richard's clients, the furniture arranged for optimal entertaining, the perfectly coordinated color schemes that had nothing to do with my personal taste. In my closet, designer clothes hung in meticulous order, each piece selected to project the image of the successful businessman's wife. I couldn't remember the last time I had bought something simply because I loved it, because it made me happy to wear it. I found myself in Richard's study, a room I rarely entered when he wasn't present. His desk was immaculate as always, no personal items left in view. Richard had always been careful about what he committed to paper, preferring verbal agreements. When possible, keeping potentially sensitive information secure. Opening his desk drawer required no breaking in. I knew where the key was kept, though I had never had reason to use it before. Inside, I found exactly what I expected. Neatly labeled files, a spare set of cufflinks, business cards in a silver holder, and then, in the back corner, a small velvet box. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, already suspecting what I would find. The necklace inside was exquisite, a teardrop emerald surrounded by diamonds on a platinum chain. Expensive, tasteful, exactly the sort of gift Richard would select. But it wasn't my style, had never been my preference. In 30 years of marriage, Richard had never given me emeralds, knowing I preferred sapphires. This necklace wasn't meant for me. It was for Vanessa, whose fondness for emeralds dated back to her college years. I replaced the box exactly as I had found it, locked the drawer, and returned to my sitting room. The evidence was accumulating, each piece fitting neatly into a pattern I should have recognized much earlier. Richard and Vanessa were not hiding their relationship. They were simply waiting for the right moment to bring it into the open. and I had a decision to make. I could confront them immediately, demand explanations, dissolve into the tearful, betrayed wife they likely expected me to be. I could file for divorce, citing the infidelity clause, and claim my share of the properties and business interests. I could negotiate a settlement that would ensure my financial security for the rest of my life. Or I could wait, watch, plan. Let them believe they were still controlling the narrative while I prepared to rewrite the ending. As the sun set over Lake Michigan, casting long shadows across the lawn I had so carefully designed, I made my choice. Richard had taught me many things during our marriage, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was one he never intended: patience in pursuit of advantage. I would give them enough rope to hang themselves, documenting everything, building my case methodically. And when the time was right, I would reveal not just that I knew about their betrayal, but that I held the power to determine what happened next. For the first time in 30 years, I was no longer simply Richard Mitchell's wife, the perfect accessory to his success. I was Marlo Winters, and I was about to reclaim control of my own story. When Richard and Vanessa returned from Naples, their faces were flushed with the particular glow that comes from stolen happiness. They brought back salt-scented air and secrets in their luggage, unaware that I had spent their absence constructing a foundation for my independence. I greeted them in the foyer with practiced warmth, accepting Richard's perfunctory kiss on my cheek and Vanessa's overly enthusiastic hug. "The property looks spectacular," Richard announced, handing his bags to our housekeeper. "We've got some excellent ideas for the Foundation's retreat program." "I can't wait to hear all about it," I replied, noting how Vanessa couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Why don't you get settled while I finish preparing dinner? We can discuss it over a glass of wine." As they retreated to their respective rooms, at least maintaining that pretense, I returned to the kitchen where I had been preparing Richard's favorite meal, beef Wellington with truffle mashed potatoes. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was catering to his preferences even as I plotted my liberation from a marriage that had become a charade. During their absence, I had been busy. I had opened a separate bank account at a bank where Richard had no connections, transferring a modest but significant amount from my personal allowance fund. I had quietly retrieved my grandmother's jewelry from our safe deposit box, items that predated my marriage and were indisputably mine alone. I had contacted a real estate agent in Seattle, a city Richard detested for its progressive politics and constant rain, to inquire about rental properties suitable for a single woman starting over. Small steps, invisible movements toward a future Richard hadn't planned for me. At dinner, I watched them perform their carefully rehearsed charade, sitting at opposite ends of the table, discussing the Naples property with studied professionalism, occasionally asking my opinion on foundation matters I had managed for years before being silently removed from the process. I played my part perfectly, the supportive wife, interested but not intrusive, pleasant but not penetrating their facade with uncomfortable questions. "The caretaker mentioned the East Wing needs some repairs," Richard commented, refilling Vanessa's wine glass before offering the bottle to me. Apparently there was some water damage during the last hurricane that wasn't properly addressed. "How strange," I replied mildly. "Miguel usually calls me directly about such issues. I wonder why he didn't mention it during our monthly check-in last week." A flicker of surprise crossed Richard's face before he controlled his expression. "You spoke with Miguel last week?" "Of course," I said, cutting my beef with precision. "I speak with all our property managers regularly. It's been my responsibility for 25 years, Richard. Did you think I had suddenly stopped because you and Vanessa have taken an interest in the foundation?" Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, shooting Richard a quick, uncertain glance. I pretended not to notice, instead complimenting the wine he had selected. "By the way," I continued, smoothly, "Miguel mentioned that the master bedroom needed new linens. Apparently someone spilled red wine on the duvet. I've already ordered replacements." The silence that followed was exquisite, tense with unspoken admissions and hasty recalculations. Richard recovered first, clearing his throat and steering the conversation to safer topics. But the message had been delivered. I knew more than they realized. After dinner, as Richard and Vanessa retreated to his study for what they claimed was urgent foundation business, I called Diane. "I need a favor," I said when she answered. "Something discreet." "Anything," she replied without hesitation. Our friendship had weathered 3 decades, surviving the gradual social separation that often occurs when one friend marries significantly above their original station. Diane had never been impressed by Richard's wealth or status, which was precisely why he tolerated her continued presence in my life. "I need you to help me establish myself elsewhere," I explained. "Not immediately, but I need foundations in place before I make any moves Richard might notice." Diane didn't ask for explanations. "You're finally leaving him." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, but on my terms, not his." The following weeks established a strange new rhythm in our household. Richard and Vanessa grew increasingly bold in their affair, secure in what they perceived as my obliviousness or resignation. They took fewer precautions, their hands lingering. In contact during meals, their private conversations becoming less private, their excuses for time alone growing thinner. I maintained my performance flawlessly, playing the part of the devoted wife whose focus remained on maintaining the perfect home and social calendar. I organized a charity auction for the hospital board, scheduled renovations to our formal dining room, hosted a dinner for Richard's most important clients with my usual attention to detail. If anyone noticed the slight distance in my smile or the new reserve in my manner, they attributed it to age or the natural cooling of a long marriage. Behind this carefully constructed facade, I was meticulously documenting everything. I photographed credit card statements showing matching hotel charges in cities where Richard claimed to be traveling alone. I saved text messages from our household, staff that inadvertently confirmed Richard and Vanessa's closeness. I recorded dates, times, and observations in a password-protected document stored on a cloud account Richard knew nothing about. I also began the careful process of reclaiming pieces of myself that had been subsumed by my role as Mrs. Richard Mitchell. I enrolled in an online art history course, rekindling the passion I had abandoned after college. I reconnected with friends who had drifted away as my social circle narrowed to Richard's business associates and their wives. I began taking long walks alone, reacquainting myself with the simple pleasure of solitude. Small acts of independence that prepared me for a life after Richard. One evening, as I was reviewing estate planning documents with our financial advisor, another preparatory step carefully disguised as routine business, Richard entered my sitting room without knocking, something he had rarely done even in the early years of our marriage. "We need to discuss something," he announced, dismissing the advisor with a peremptory nod. "Thank you, James. My wife and I need some privacy." I maintained my composure, calmly gathering the documents as James excused himself. "What's so urgent, Richard? I was in the middle of something important." He paced the room, uncharacteristically agitated. Richard had always prided himself on his control, on never revealing more emotion than strategically advantageous. This visible discomfort signaled something significant. "I've been thinking about our future," he began, still pacing. "We've had a good run, Marlowe. 30 years is a substantial investment of time by anyone's standards." I folded my hands in my lap, waiting. This was it. The conversation I had been anticipating for weeks. Richard was finally preparing to end our marriage, having arranged all the pieces to his satisfaction. "But people change," he continued, using almost exactly the same words he had used weeks earlier. "Priorities shift. What fulfills us at 22 isn't necessarily what fulfills us at 67. Or 52, I added quietly. He paused, momentarily thrown by my interruption. Yes, exactly. We've both reached ages where we have to consider how we want to spend our remaining years. I nodded encouragingly, as if this philosophical framing was necessary or helpful, rather than a transparent attempt to justify what was coming next. I've been doing a lot of soul-searching, Richard said, finally sitting across from me. About what truly makes me happy, what I want for this final chapter of my life. And what have you concluded? I asked, my voice steady despite the absurdity of the situation. Richard had never soul-searched a day in his life. His decisions had always been calculated moves toward greater advantage, whether in business or personal matters. He looked directly at me for the first time in the conversation. I think we should consider separation, Marlowe. An amicable parting that acknowledges the value of what we've built together while allowing us both to pursue individual happiness. Individual happiness. As if my happiness had ever factored into his calculations. I see, I said, allowing a small frown to crease my forehead. This seems rather sudden, Richard. Is there something specific that's prompted this soul-searching? His expression shifted subtly, relief that I wasn't becoming hysterical, caution about revealing too much. Nothing specific, no. Just a growing recognition that we've been moving in different directions for some time. The lie hung between us, so blatant it was almost insulting. 30 years of marriage, and he couldn't even offer me the dignity of honesty in its dissolution. Different directions, I repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective. I wasn't aware we had been moving at all. Our lives have seemed rather stationary to me. Richard's relief at my apparent calm emboldened him. That's part of the issue, perhaps. Stagnation isn't healthy for anyone. We both deserve a chance to grow in new ways before it's too late. I allowed a sad smile to cross my face. And does this new growth happen to involve my sister? The color drained. From his face so quickly, I momentarily worried he might have a stroke. At 67, despite his rigorous exercise regimen and carefully monitored diet, Richard was still susceptible to the effects of sudden stress. What are you talking about? He managed finally, but the question lacked conviction. Please, Richard, I said gently, let's not compound the situation with unnecessary lies. I know about you and Vanessa. I've known for some time. He stared at me, calculations visibly running behind his eyes. Denial, confirmation, justification. Could almost see him weighing each option, assessing potential damage and optimal outcomes. How? He asked finally. Does it matter? I countered. The fact remains that you and my sister have been having an affair, and now you've decided it's time to discard 30 years of marriage in favor of a relationship with a woman nearly 20 years your junior, who also happens to be my only sibling. Put so plainly, the situation sounded as tawdry as it actually was. Richard winced slightly, no doubt preferring the noble narrative of personal growth and individual fulfillment he had constructed. It's not that simple, Marlowe, he said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when negotiating difficult contracts. Vanessa and I didn't plan this. Our feelings developed naturally through our work together. We've both been fighting it, aware of how complicated the situation is. How considerate of you both, I remarked, unable to completely suppress the sarcasm. And how long has this natural development been occurring? Richard hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of honesty against the potential consequences of continued deception. About 18 months, he admitted finally. But it only became physical recently. Another lie. I had evidence of their involvement dating back well over a year, but I saw no advantage in revealing the full extent of my knowledge. Let him believe he was controlling the narrative. I see, I said again, folding, my hands primly in my lap. And what exactly did you envision happening next, Richard? After this amicable separation you proposed? He seemed relieved that I was discussing logistics rather than succumbing to emotional outbursts. Richard had always been most comfortable in the realm of practical arrangements. I thought we could handle this privately, avoid unnecessary public drama, he explained, confidence returning to his voice. I've had Patricia draft some preliminary papers. Very generous terms, Marlowe. You'd retain this house, of course, and I'd ensure you maintain the lifestyle you're accustomed to. How thoughtful, I murmured. And what about the Naples property? Our apartment building on Lakeshore Drive? The Mitchell Investments headquarters building? His expression hardened slightly. Those are business assets, Marlowe. They're not part of our marital property in any meaningful sense. The prenup clearly established that. I smiled, the expression not reaching my eyes. Actually, Richard, I believe you should review the prenup again, particularly the clauses related to infidelity involving family members. The flash of uncertainty across his face was deeply satisfying. Clearly, he had not remembered that particular provision, or had assumed I wouldn't discover or invoke it after so many years. That's an obscure clause written decades ago, he said dismissively, but I could hear the undercurrent of concern in his voice. No court would seriously consider— Perhaps not, I interrupted smoothly. But then, courts tend to be unpredictable, don't they? Especially when infidelity is involved, and even more so when that infidelity includes such an unsavory element as seducing your wife's sister. Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time, I glimpsed genuine anger beneath his controlled exterior. Be reasonable, Marlowe. Neither of us wants a protracted legal battle that would only hurt everyone involved. Think about what public disclosure would do to your reputation, to your social standing. The implicit threat was clear. Fight me, and I'll destroy your place in the world we've inhabited together. It might have worked once, when my identity was so thoroughly entwined with being Mrs. Richard Mitchell that I couldn't imagine existence outside that framework. But that was before I had begun reconstructing the woman I had been before Richard, before I had started imagining a future that wasn't defined by his parameters. My reputation, I mused, as if considering his point seriously. Yes, that's certainly a consideration. The devoted wife betrayed by her husband and sister after 30 years of marriage. I imagine I'd receive quite a lot of sympathy, actually. Richard's expression darkened. Don't be naive. Scandal doesn't benefit anyone, regardless of who appears more sympathetic. We've built a life in circles where discretion is valued above all else. Circles you built, I corrected gently. Circles that have always been more important to you than to me. That's revisionist history, Marlowe. You've enjoyed every advantage of our position in those circles for 30 years. He wasn't entirely wrong. I had adapted to wealth and privilege with remarkable ease, had learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of Chicago's elite, had even found genuine satisfaction in certain aspects of our lifestyle. But I had also surrendered parts of myself that I was only now rediscovering, ambitions and interests that had nothing to do with Richard's world. Perhaps, I acknowledged, but that doesn't mean I can't survive outside them. Richard studied me, clearly reassessing the situation. He had expected tears, recriminations, perhaps desperate attempts to save our marriage. My calm assessment of the situation and clear-eyed negotiating stance were outside his predicted scenarios. What exactly do you want, Marlowe? He asked. Finally. It was the first honest question he had posed since entering the room. Time, I replied simply. I need time to consider my options and determine what an acceptable resolution would look like. This isn't a business deal with a convenient deadline, Richard. It's the dismantling of 3 decades of my life. He nodded slowly, relief evident in his posture. Richard understood negotiating tactics, and my request seemed reasonable within that framework. Of course. Take whatever time you need. there's no rush. No rush. Except for the fact that he and Vanessa were clearly eager to bring their relationship into the open, to stop pretending their connection was purely professional or familial. But Richard was confident in his ability to outweight me, to eventually maneuver me into accepting whatever terms he deemed appropriate. "Thank you," I said, rising gracefully to indicate our conversation was over. "I appreciate your honesty, belated though it may be. Please tell Patricia not to proceed with any paperwork just yet. I'll be consulting with my own attorney before making any decisions." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face at the mention of my separate legal representation, but he nodded again. "Naturally. Though I hope we can resolve this without turning it into an adversarial process." I smiled, the expression not reaching my eyes. That would be my preference as well. 30 years together deserves a dignified conclusion, don't you think? After Richard left, I remained seated in my sitting room, staring out at the garden now covered in early autumn colors. The confrontation had gone almost exactly as I had anticipated. Richard initiating the separation on his terms, offering what he considered generous concessions while protecting his core assets, assuming I would eventually acquiesce to preserve peace and stability. What he didn't understand, what he had never understood, was that I was no longer the 22-year-old who had signed his prenuptial agreement with stars in her eyes. I was a woman who had spent 3 decades studying Richard Mitchell's tactics, observing his strengths and weaknesses, learning the subtle arts of negotiation and strategic patience that he considered his exclusive domain. I picked up my phone and texted Diane. It started. He made his opening move. Her response came immediately. "Are you okay?" Was I okay? The question was more complex than it appeared. My marriage was ending. My relationship with my only sibling was irreparably damaged. The life I had built over 30 years was disintegrating around me. And yet, I felt more clear-headed than I had in years. The fog of compromise and accommodation that had gradually enveloped me was lifting, revealing possibilities I had long since stopped considering. "I'm better than okay," I replied. "I'm finally awake." When Vanessa approached me the following morning, her face a study in practiced contrition, I was prepared. I had been expecting this conversation. Richard would have reported our discussion, and they would have agreed that Vanessa should attempt to smooth things over, woman to woman, sister to sister. "Can we talk?" she asked, hovering in the doorway of the breakfast room where I was enjoying my usual morning coffee and fruit. Richard had already left for the office, maintaining the fiction of normal routine. "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Would you like some coffee?" She sat, declining the coffee with a nervous shake of her head. I noticed she had dressed with particular care, a modest blouse in a color that flattered her complexion, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a simple style that emphasized the family resemblance between us. The image of the humble penitent, carefully constructed to evoke sympathy. "Marlo, I don't even know where to begin," she started, her voice catching on what might have been genuine emotion or skilled performance. With Vanessa, it was often difficult to distinguish between the two. "Richard told me you know about us." I nodded, taking a deliberate sip of my coffee. "Yes." She waited for me to say more, to rage or weep or demand explanations. When I remained silent, she continued uncertainly. "I never meant for this to happen. You have to believe that. When I came to stay here, it was exactly what I told you. I needed space after my breakup, time to figure things out. There was never a plan to begin an affair with my husband," I supplied calmly. "To betray the sister who has supported you financially and emotionally throughout your adult life? To participate in the dissolution of a 30-year marriage?" Vanessa flinched as if I had slapped her. "When you put it that way, it sounds horrible." "How would you put it, Vanessa? In what possible framing is this not a profound betrayal?" She twisted her hands in her lap, a childhood gesture I hadn't seen in years. It's complicated, Marlo. Richard and we connect in ways I can't explain. It's like we understand each other on a level that transcends conventional relationships. I suppressed a mirthless laugh. The cliché was so predictable it was almost disappointing. Transcendent understanding. How convenient that this spiritual connection manifested after Richard had accumulated considerable wealth and status, rather than when you first met him 30 years ago. Anger flashed briefly in her eyes before she controlled her expression. That's not fair. This isn't about Richard's money or position. We genuinely care for each other. I'm sure you do, I replied, my tone neutral. After all, you've both demonstrated such capacity for care and consideration in your actions thus far. Vanessa leaned forward, her face earnest. I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be. But Richard and I didn't choose these feelings. They just happened. Haven't you ever experienced something that felt bigger than yourself? Something you couldn't control no matter how hard you tried? The question was presumably rhetorical, but I considered it seriously. Had I ever felt that kind of overwhelming connection, that irresistible pull toward another person? Perhaps, briefly, in my early 20s, before practicality and ambition led me to accept Richard's proposal. But I had made choices, conscious decisions to prioritize certain values over others. I had not allowed myself to be swept away by emotion when it conflicted with commitment. No, I said finally. I haven't. I've always believed that adults make choices and accept the consequences of those choices. Feelings may be involuntary, but actions are not. Vanessa sighed, frustration evident in the sound. I knew you wouldn't understand. You've always been so controlled, so perfect. You've never allowed yourself to be messy or impulsive or fully human. The accusation stung more than I would have expected. Was that how my sister saw me? As some cold, calculating machine incapable of genuine feeling? Had I become so adept at sublimating my own desires that even those closest to me perceived me as emotionally stunted? Perhaps, I acknowledged, surprising her with my candor. But that control, that perfectionism you deride, it was in service to commitments I made, promises I intended to keep. And you've kept them, she insisted, seizing on what she perceived as an opening. For 30 years, you've been exactly what Richard needed, what everyone expected. Isn't it time you allowed yourself some freedom, some genuine happiness? The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Vanessa was attempting to reframe her betrayal as a gift, liberation from a marriage that had supposedly confined me, despite having no evidence that I felt confined or desired release. Is that the narrative you've constructed to justify your actions? I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. That you're somehow doing me a favor by sleeping with my husband? That's remarkably convenient. Vanessa flushed, the color spreading, across her cheeks and down her neck. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I'm just trying to find some way for us all to move forward without destroying each other. A worthy goal, I agreed. Though perhaps one that might have been considered before you and Richard embarked on your transcendent connection. She stood abruptly, patience exhausted. I came here hoping for an actual conversation, Marlo. Not to be treated like a misbehaving child. And I had hoped for a sister who wouldn't betray me in the most fundamental way possible, I countered, my voice finally showing a hint of the anger I had so carefully contained. It seems we're both disappointed. Vanessa paused at the doorway, turning back with an expression that mingled frustration and what might have been genuine remorse. I do love you, Marlo. That hasn't changed. And I am sorry for hurting you. Truly sorry. But I'm not sorry for how I feel about Richard. After she left, I remained at the breakfast table, finishing my coffee with deliberate calm. The conversation had confirmed what I already suspected. Richard and Vanessa had convinced themselves that their relationship was somehow exceptional, exempt from ordinary moral considerations. They had constructed a narrative that cast their betrayal as inevitable, perhaps even beneficial to all concerned. It was a comforting fiction, one that allowed them to pursue what they wanted without confronting the full ethical implications of their choices. And in their carefully constructed story, I was cast as the cold, controlled wife who had never truly understood or fulfilled Richard's emotional needs, a convenient justification for his infidelity. The irony, of course, was that their perception of me as emotionless and calculating was precisely what would allow me to navigate this situation on my terms rather than theirs. While they were entangled in the drama of forbidden love and family conflict, I was quietly assembling the pieces of a new life, one that existed completely outside their sphere of influence. Let them believe whatever narrative made their betrayal palatable. I had my own story to write, and it no longer included either of them in leading roles. The wheels of divorce turned slowly, even when all parties claimed to want an amicable resolution. In the weeks following Richard's confession, our home became a theater of uncomfortable performances. Richard maintained a careful distance, treating me with exaggerated courtesy when our paths crossed. Vanessa oscillated between awkward attempts at normalcy and dramatic displays of guilt, neither approach feeling genuine. I continued my daily routines with practiced precision, revealing nothing of my evolving plans. My first meeting with Martin, Goldstein, after Richard's confession, confirmed what I had already suspected. The specific infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement gave me extraordinary leverage. "The language is unusually clear," Martin said, reviewing the document in his downtown office, safely away from Richard's network of informants. "And the evidence you've gathered is more than sufficient. If you choose to invoke this clause, Richard would face significant financial consequences beyond what a standard divorce would entail." "And the confidentiality aspects?" I asked, examining the manicured nails that had become part of my carefully maintained appearance as Mrs. Richard Mitchell. "What exactly would become public record?" Martin adjusted his glasses, a habitual gesture when delivering particularly important information. "Everything. Financial transactions, property transfers, investment structures, all the business arrangements Richard has so carefully kept private over the years." It would be illuminating to many of his associates. I nodded, absorbing this confirmation of what I had intuited. Richard's business success had always contained elements he preferred to keep from public scrutiny. Not explicitly illegal activities, perhaps, but arrangements that existed in the gray areas of financial regulations, partnerships that benefited from discretion, tax strategies that relied on particular interpretations of the law. And if I don't invoke the clause? If I agree to a standard dissolution following the general terms of the prenup? "You'd still receive a generous settlement by most standards," Martin acknowledged. "The house in Lakeside, a lump sum payment, ongoing support. But you'd forfeit the Naples property, the apartment building, and any interest in Mitchell investments. More importantly, you'd lose the leverage that comes with the threat of public disclosure." I considered this information carefully. My goal wasn't to destroy Richard, satisfying as that might momentarily feel. My objective was to emerge from this marriage with the resources and freedom to build something meaningful for myself, something entirely separate from the life Richard had designed around me. "I don't want a protracted legal battle," I said finally. "But I won't be dismissed with whatever consolation prize Richard deems appropriate after 30 years of marriage." Martin smiled, a rare expression on his habitually serious face. "I've known you for almost as long as you've been married to Richard, Marlowe. In all that time, I don't think I've ever heard you express what you want so clearly." His observation surprised me. Had I really been so opaque about my own desires, even to those who knew me well? Or had I simply become so accustomed to subordinating my wishes to Richard's that I had stopped articulating them altogether? I'm discovering that I have quite a lot of opinions, I replied, returning his smile, with a small one of my own. 30 years of accumulated thoughts I never expressed. Well, now is an excellent time to start expressing them, Martin said, his tone becoming more businesslike as he gathered his notes. I suggest we begin by drafting our own proposal rather than responding to whatever Richard's attorneys present. Let's define the terms from the outset. I left Martin's office feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of agency, of directing my own narrative rather than playing a supporting role in someone else's. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. For decades, I had allowed Richard to make the major decisions in our lives, to establish the parameters within which I operated. Now, every choice was mine alone to make. When I returned home, I found Richard waiting in the kitchen, an unusual location for him at that hour. He typically avoided domestic spaces during the day, preferring the masculine territory of his study or the neutral ground of the living room for necessary conversations. "Where have you been?" he asked, his tone casual, though his posture suggested tension. "I tried calling your cell." I set my handbag on the counter, noticing that I had indeed missed 2 calls from him. "I had an appointment downtown. Is there something urgent you needed?" Richard studied me, clearly trying to gauge whether my appointment had been with an attorney. "Patricia has prepared some preliminary divorce papers for review. I thought we might discuss them this evening. Start moving this process forward in a civilized manner." The presumption was so typically Richard, assuming I would simply review and accept whatever terms his attorney had drafted, grateful for the opportunity to resolve our situation civilly. "I'm afraid I have plans this evening," I replied, opening the refrigerator to retrieve a bottle of water. "And, as I mentioned previously, I'll be consulting with my own attorney before reviewing any proposals." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Marlowe, there's no need to make this adversarial. We both want the same thing, a quick, quiet resolution that preserves dignity for everyone involved." I took a deliberate sip of water, studying him over the rim of the glass. Richard looked tired, I realized. The confident facade he maintained in public had slipped slightly, revealing the strain of navigating a situation he couldn't simply control, through financial leverage or social pressure. "Do we want the same thing, Richard? I'm not certain we do. You want to transition smoothly from one relationship to another with minimal disruption to your financial empire and social standing. My priorities may be different." "What exactly are your priorities?" he asked, a hint of genuine curiosity breaking through his practiced negotiator's demeanor. It was a fair question, one I was still formulating answers to myself. What did I want from this dissolution of 30 years of partnership? Financial security, yes. Freedom to pursue interests I had set aside, absolutely. But there was something else, something less tangible, but perhaps more essential. "Recognition," I said finally. Acknowledgement that my contributions to our life together had value beyond being a convenient social accessory. Richard's expression shifted, surprise, and something like discomfort crossing his features. "I've never thought of you as just an accessory, Marlowe." "Haven't you?" I challenged gently. "When was the last time you asked what I wanted? What would make me happy or fulfilled? When did my preferences ever outweigh your convenience?" He didn't answer immediately, perhaps genuinely searching his memory for examples that would contradict my assessment. His silence was more revealing than any defense he might have offered. "We had an arrangement that worked for both of us," he said finally. "You enjoyed the lifestyle my success provided. You had freedom to pursue your interests." "What interests, Richard? The ones you approved of? The ones that complemented your image or advanced your social connections?" He shook his head, frustration evident in the gesture. "This revisionist history doesn't serve either of us, Marlowe. You made choices too. No one forced you to become the person you are now. There was truth in his statement, uncomfortable as it was to acknowledge. I had indeed made choices, had consciously set aside certain ambitions, had tailored my interests to fit within the parameters of what enhanced rather than detracted from Richard's world. The recognition that I had been complicit in my own diminishment was perhaps the most painful aspect of my current awakening. "You're right," I conceded, surprising him. "I made choices, and now I'm making different ones." I left him standing in the kitchen, retreating to my sitting room where I had begun assembling digital files of artwork for the gallery I hoped to open someday. Small steps toward a future I was only beginning to envision clearly. That evening, I met Diane for dinner at a small restaurant in a neighborhood Richard would never frequent. Too bohemian, too lacking in the particular markers of status he recognized. The menu featured locally sourced ingredients prepared with more enthusiasm than precision. The wine list was limited but thoughtfully selected, and the clientele represented a diverse mix of ages and apparent socioeconomic backgrounds. "You look different," Diane observed as we settled at our table. "More present somehow." I smiled, appreciating her perceptiveness. "I feel different, like I'm waking up from a very long, very comfortable nap." Diane had been my friend since college, had watched me transform from an ambitious art history student with dreams of opening a gallery into Richard Mitchell's perfect wife. She had never criticized my choices directly, but I had occasionally caught glimpses of concern in her eyes when I explained why I had abandoned yet another personal project to focus on some aspect of supporting Richard's career. "So what's the plan?" she asked, bypassing pleasantries in favor of practical matters. "Martin seemed to think you're in a surprisingly strong position legally." "I am," I confirmed, sharing the details of the infidelity clause and its implications. "But I'm not interested in a scorched earth approach. I want enough to establish a new life completely independent of Richard, not to destroy him out of spite." Diane nodded approvingly. "And what does this new independent life look like?" Still, thinking about Seattle? The mention of Seattle, a city I had visited only once on a trip Richard had cut short because he found the constant drizzle depressing, sparked an unexpected surge of excitement. I had been researching neighborhoods, rental prices, the local art scene, identifying areas where a small gallery might thrive. "I think so," I said, feeling a smile spread across my face. "It feels right somehow. Far enough away to prevent casual interference, but still connected enough to the art world to make my plans viable." "Your plans," Diane repeated, raising her wine glass in a small toast. "I like the sound of that." We spent the evening discussing practical considerations, how to transfer assets without triggering Richard's suspicions, the logistics of relocating across the country, strategies for building new social and professional connections in an unfamiliar city. By the time we finished our dessert, shared between us as a small rebellion against decades of watching our figures to maintain the standard of beauty expected in Richard's social circle, I had a clearer vision of my next steps. "What about Vanessa?" Diane asked as we waited for the check. "Have you decided how to handle that relationship moving forward?" The question sobered me immediately. For all my planning about financial and practical matters, I had been avoiding the more emotionally complex question of my sister's betrayal. The pain was still too raw, the breach of trust too fundamental to process fully. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me can't imagine ever trusting her again. But she's my only sibling. Once my parents are gone, she's the only family I'll have left." Diane reached across the table, squeezing my hand gently. "Family isn't always blood, Marlowe. Sometimes it's the people who show up for you when it matters most." Her words stayed with me as I drove home later that night, the streets of Lakeside nearly empty at that hour. The neighborhood had always felt like a sanctuary of sorts. Elegant homes set back from tree-lined streets, tasteful landscaping illuminated by discreet lighting, an aura of prosperity carefully maintained through homeowners association regulations and unspoken social expectations. I wondered what it would feel like to leave this carefully curated environment for the unpredictability of a city I barely knew. Would I miss the comfort of familiar surroundings, the security of established social protocols? Or would the freedom from those very constraints prove exhilarating rather than terrifying? When I arrived home, the house was dark, except for a light in Richard's study. I moved quietly through the foyer, not deliberately avoiding him, but not seeking interaction either. As I passed his doorway, however, his voice stopped me. "Marlo, could you come in for a moment?" I paused, considering whether to claim fatigue and continue to my room. But curiosity won out. Richard rarely initiated conversations these days, unless they pertained directly to the logistics of our impending separation. His study was unchanged from the days when our marriage had seemed secure. Leather-bound books lining custom shelves, the antique desk I had found at an estate sale in our early years together, the subtle scent of the sandalwood candles I had always made sure were available because Richard claimed they helped him think more clearly. The room was so familiar, yet suddenly foreign, like revisiting a childhood home after decades away. Richard was seated behind his desk, documents spread before him, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked older in the warm lamplight, the lines around his eyes more pronounced, his shoulders slightly hunched in a way I had never noticed before. "Patricia sent over the preliminary agreement," he said without preamble, gesturing to the papers. "I'd like you to at least review it before dismissing it outright." I remained standing just inside the doorway, maintaining physical distance that reflected the emotional gulf between us. "I've been clear about my position, Richard. I'll review proposals after consulting with my attorney, not before." He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture of frustration I had witnessed countless times during our marriage. "This doesn't have to be complicated, Marlo. I'm prepared to be generous, more than generous, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," I repeated, the phrase igniting a flicker of anger I had been carefully containing. "You mean the circumstance where my husband of 30 years is leaving me for my sister? Those circumstances?" Richard winced slightly, but pressed on. "Yes, those circumstances, which we both know are painful and unfortunate but don't need to result in mutually assured destruction." I studied him, trying to see the man I had married beneath the negotiator's facade. Had he always been this person, calculating, compartmentalizing, reducing emotional devastation to a business problem requiring practical solutions? Or had decades in the financial world gradually transformed him into someone who viewed even the most intimate relationships through the lens of asset allocation and risk management? "I'm not interested in destruction, mutual or otherwise," I said finally. "But I won't be managed or manipulated, Richard. Not anymore." He looked genuinely perplexed. "I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm trying to find a reasonable path forward that acknowledges your contributions to our marriage while allowing us both to move on with minimal damage." "My contributions to our marriage," I echoed, the words tasting bitter. 30 years of my life reduced to a line item in a settlement agreement." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What do you want from me, Marlo? An apology? Endless self-flagellation? What purpose would that serve now?" It was a fair question, one that forced me to examine my own motivations more honestly. Did I want Richard to suffer? To acknowledge the depth of his betrayal? To validate the anger and hurt I was struggling to process? "I want you to recognize what you're throwing away," I said finally, surprising myself with the honesty. "Not just a convenient social partner or a well-trained hostess, but a woman who gave up her own dreams to help build yours. A woman who loved you enough to reshape herself into whatever you needed." The admission hung in the air between us, more vulnerable than I had intended. Richard's expression shifted, something like genuine regret flickering across his features. "I do recognize that," he said quietly. I know what you sacrificed, Marlo. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry that it wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough to make those sacrifices worthwhile in the end. The apology, unexpected and seemingly sincere, caught me off guard. For a moment, I glimpsed the Richard I had fallen in love with decades earlier, the man capable of emotional insight and genuine connection beneath the polished exterior. It was disorienting, this sudden reminder of what had drawn me to him. Initially, what had sustained my commitment through years of gradual emotional distancing. "Thank you for that," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "But it doesn't change where we are now." He nodded, accepting this reality with the same pragmatism he applied to business setbacks. "No, it doesn't. But perhaps it can inform how we proceed, with respect for what was, even as we acknowledge it's over." I left his study shortly after, emotions more complicated than when I had entered. Richard's moment of genuine remorse had not changed my determination to secure my independence, but it had reminded me that our story was not a simple tale of villain and victim. We had both made choices, had both compromised aspects of ourselves, to maintain a partnership that had, for many years, provided each of us with things we valued. The recognition didn't lessen the pain of betrayal or the anger at discovering Richard and Vanessa's affair. But it did help me clarify what I wanted from the dissolution of our marriage. Not vengeance or punitive justice, but enough resources and freedom to rediscover the woman I might have become without the constraints of being Mrs. Richard Mitchell. The following morning, I received an unexpected call from Tom Reynolds, Richard's oldest business partner, and one of the few people in his professional circle who had always treated me as more than an extension of my husband. "Marlo," he greeted me, his voice carrying its usual warmth. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all, Tom. It's good to hear from you." And it was. Tom had always been kind, had asked about my interests beyond charity work and home decoration, had seemed genuinely interested in my responses. "I was hoping we might have lunch today if you're available," he continued. "There are some matters I'd like to discuss that would be better addressed in person." The invitation was unusual. While Tom and his wife had been regular guests at our home over the years, he had never sought my company individually, particularly not for a private conversation. My initial suspicion was that Richard had enlisted him as an emissary, hoping Tom's more personable approach might succeed where Richard's direct negotiation had failed. "That sounds lovely, Tom, but I have to ask, is this at Richard's request?" Tom's laugh carried clearly over the phone line. "Richard would be apoplectic if he knew I was calling you. No, this is entirely my initiative, and if you agree to meet, I'd appreciate your discretion." Curiosity piqued, I agreed to meet him at a small French bistro downtown, far from the steakhouses and power lunch establishments Richard and his associates typically frequented. Tom was already seated when I arrived, rising to greet me with the old-world courtesy that had always set him apart from Richard's other business associates. At 72, he remained remarkably vital, his silver hair still thick, his posture straight, his mind as sharp as when I had first met him 30 years earlier. "You look well, Marlo," he said after we had ordered. Better than I might have expected, given the circumstances. So he knew about the impending divorce. Given his close relationship with Richard, that wasn't surprising, though I wondered how much detail Richard had shared about the specific circumstances. "I'm adapting," I replied neutrally. "It's been an educational period." Tom nodded, sympathy evident in his expression. "I can imagine. Richard has always been a challenging partner, even in the best of circumstances." The characterization startled a small laugh from me. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it." "Diplomacy has always been my role," Tom acknowledged with a rueful smile. "Balancing Richard's more aggressive tendencies with a measure of humanity. It's been an exhausting 35 years. I studied him with new interest. Tom had always represented the more approachable, personable face of Mitchell Investments, the partner clients turned to when Richard's focus on the bottom line became too intense. I had assumed it was a natural division of labor based on their different personalities. But Tom's description suggested something more deliberate, a conscious strategy to offset Richard's harsher aspects. "I'm sure Richard appreciates your complimentary approach," I offered, still unsure where this conversation was heading. Tom's expression turned serious. "Richard appreciates results. The methods have always been secondary to him." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Which brings me to the reason I asked to meet with you." He reached into his briefcase, retrieving a folder which he placed on the table between us. "I understand from certain legal inquiries that you're aware of the specific infidelity clause in your prenuptial agreement, the one involving family members." I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was startled. Someone in Martin's office must have been making preliminary inquiries into Mitchell Investments' structure, preparations for potentially invoking the clause. "I'm aware of it," I confirmed cautiously. Tom nodded, tapping the folder lightly. "What you may not be aware of is exactly what would be revealed if the confidentiality provisions of that agreement were suspended." "Financial irregularities?" I guessed, wondering if Tom was here to warn me off, to protect Richard's business interests. "Nothing so dramatic as fraud or explicit illegality," Tom clarified. "Richard is too careful for that. But there are arrangements that would raise serious questions if subjected to public or regulatory scrutiny, particularly regarding the property assets listed in Appendix C of your prenup." I leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite myself. "The Naples property? The apartment building? The company headquarters?" "All three," Tom confirmed. "Each was acquired through a complex series of transactions designed to minimize tax liability and maximize leverage. Perfectly legal when viewed individually, but when examined as a pattern." He trailed off significantly. "Why are you telling me this, Tom? Are you worried I'll damage the company if I invoke the clause?" He smiled, the expression surprisingly warm given the subject matter. "On the contrary, Marlowe. I'm providing context to help you make an informed decision about how to proceed. Richard is operating under the assumption that you'll ultimately accept whatever settlement terms he proposes, rather than risk a protracted legal battle that might damage your comfortable lifestyle. He underestimates me," I said quietly. "He always has," Tom agreed readily. "It's his greatest weakness as a businessman and, I suspect, as a husband. He sees what he expects to see, not what's actually there." The assessment was surprisingly insightful, capturing something fundamental about Richard that I had observed but never articulated so clearly. Throughout our marriage, Richard had related to the version of me he had constructed in his mind, the perfect corporate wife, grateful for the privileges of wealth, content with the parameters he established. He had never bothered to look beneath that surface, to discover the woman still alive beneath the role I had perfected. "And what do you see, Tom?" I asked, curious about his perspective after decades of observing Richard and me together. "I see a woman who has finally recognized her own value," he replied simply. "And I see an opportunity for justice that goes beyond financial settlements." He opened the folder, revealing documents I couldn't immediately interpret. Financial statements, property records, partnership agreements. "These copies are for you. They outline the specific structures Richard has created around the properties, named in your prenup. Take them to your attorney. They'll help you understand exactly what leverage you possess." I stared at him, confused by his apparent betrayal of his longest business relationship. "Why would you do this? You and Richard have been partners for decades." Tom's expression turned contemplative. "Partners, yes. But not friends. Not in any meaningful sense. Richard doesn't have friends, Marlowe. He has assets and liabilities, resources to be utilized and obstacles to be managed." The assessment was harsh, but not inaccurate. Richard's approach to relationships had always been transactional at its core, each connection evaluated for its potential value or cost to his overall objectives. "And what am I in that calculation?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Initially an asset," Tom said bluntly. "A beautiful, intelligent young woman who enhanced his social standing and created the perfect environment for his business advancement. Later, a comfortable fixture, neither asset nor liability, but part of the established structure of his life. And now?" "Now you're a problem to be solved," Tom replied, his directness softened by evident sympathy. "An unexpected variable in what he assumed would be a straightforward equation." I nodded, accepting the assessment without offense. It aligned with my own understanding of how Richard operated, how he categorized the people and circumstances in his life. "That still doesn't explain why you're helping me," I pointed out, gesturing to the folder he had provided. Tom was silent for a moment, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "Let's just say that after 35 years of watching Richard prioritize wealth accumulation over human consideration, I find a certain satisfaction in the possibility that he might finally face consequences for his approach to relationships." There was something personal in his tone, suggesting that Tom's motivations went beyond abstract justice or business ethics. But before I could probe further, he continued. "Besides, I'm retiring at the end of the year. My partnership agreement is already settled. Richard can't touch me, no matter how this plays out." After lunch, I took the folder Tom had provided directly to Martin's office, where we spent hours reviewing the documents together. What emerged was a clearer picture of exactly why the specific properties named in the prenup's infidelity clause were so significant to Richard's overall financial structure. "These aren't just valuable real estate holdings," Martin explained, clearly impressed by the complexity of the arrangements. "They're keystones in Richard's entire financial architecture. The Naples property serves as collateral for leveraged investments in emerging markets. The apartment building generates cash flow that supports a complex tax minimization strategy. And the Mitchell Investments headquarters building? That's perhaps the most ingenious structure of all." He pointed to a series of transactions documented in Tom's materials. "Richard doesn't just own the building through a holding company. He's created a sale-leaseback arrangement where Mitchell Investments pays rent to the holding company, which then flows through several entities before returning to Richard personally as consulting fees rather than regular income. It's incredibly tax-efficient and completely legal as long as each entity maintains certain formalities. And if I gained control of that building through the infidelity clause?" I asked, beginning to understand the full implications. Martin smiled, a rare expression of genuine admiration. "You'd effectively control a significant portion of Richard's personal cash flow, not just a valuable piece of real estate. And, more importantly, you'd be positioned to require full disclosure of the entire arrangement as part of any settlement negotiation." For the first time, I fully comprehended the leverage I possessed. It wasn't just about securing a fair financial settlement after 30 years of marriage. It was about holding the power to disrupt the carefully constructed financial ecosystem Richard had built, to force transparency he had specifically designed his business to avoid. The realization didn't inspire a desire for revenge, but rather a profound shift in how I viewed my position in the coming negotiations. I wasn't a supplicant hoping for generous terms. I was an equal player with significant leverage, capable of defining the parameters of any resolution. As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of calm determination replace the uncertainty and hurt that had dominated my emotional landscape since discovering Richard and Vanessa's betrayal. I wasn't just surviving this upheaval, I was finding strength I hadn't known I possessed, clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. The path forward was becoming increasingly clear, not a desperate scramble to preserve pieces of a life that no longer served me, but a deliberate journey toward something new, something entirely my own. The day I walked into Richard's study with Martin Goldstein at my side, was the day everything changed. Richard looked up from his desk, momentary confusion crossing his face before recognition set in. He hadn't expected me to bring my attorney directly into his sanctuary, hadn't anticipated this breach of the unspoken protocols that had governed our interactions for 3 decades. "Marlowe," he said, rising slowly. "I wasn't aware we had a meeting scheduled." "We don't," I replied calmly. "But I think it's time we moved this process forward, don't you?" Richard's gaze shifted to Martin, assessing the threat level. "I would have preferred that our respective attorneys handle the preliminary discussions. That's typically how these matters proceed." "Nothing about our situation is typical, Richard," I said, taking a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk without waiting for an invitation. Martin remained standing, a silent but powerful presence at my shoulder. Richard sighed, the sound containing equal parts frustration and resignation. "Very well. What exactly did you want to discuss?" I placed a folder on his desk, identical to the one Tom Reynolds had given me, containing the documentation of Richard's complex financial structures involving the properties named in our prenuptial agreement. "I'd like to discuss these arrangements," I said, tapping the folder lightly, "particularly how they might be affected by the specific infidelity clause in our prenup." The color drained from Richard's face as he opened the folder, recognizing immediately what it contained. His eyes flicked up to mine, a new wariness in his expression. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter?" I countered. "What matters is that I understand exactly what leverage I possess and what invoking that clause would mean for your carefully constructed financial ecosystem." Richard's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching at his temple, a rare visible sign of stress in a man who prided himself on emotional control. "Tom," he said flatly. It had to be Tom. I neither confirmed nor denied his conclusion, maintaining the small advantage of uncertainty. "These arrangements are perfectly legal," Richard continued, his voice taking on the confident tone he used when controlling business negotiations. "Complex, certainly, but entirely within regulatory guidelines." "Of course they are," I agreed, easily. "You've always been careful to maintain technical compliance while pushing boundaries. It's one of your greatest strengths as a businessman." Richard relaxed slightly, perhaps thinking I was being conciliatory, but I wasn't finished. "However, as I understand it, these structures depend heavily on the maintenance of certain corporate formalities and the appearance of arm's-length transactions. Public disclosure of the entire integrated system might trigger exactly the kind of regulatory scrutiny you've so carefully avoided for decades." I paused, watching the implications sink in. Richard had built his wealth through strategies that existed in the gray areas of tax and corporate law, legal when viewed as isolated. Transactions potentially problematic when examined as a coordinated pattern designed to achieve specific advantages. "What exactly do you want, Marlowe?" Richard asked, abandoning pretense in favor of direct negotiation. It was the question I had been waiting for, the opening to present terms rather than respond to Richard's predetermined offerings. "I want a clean break," I said simply. "Not just financially, but completely. I want to establish a new life entirely separate from the one we've shared, with no lingering connections or dependencies." Richard nodded slowly. "That can be arranged. The house, a generous settlement?" "The Naples property," I interrupted. "The apartment building on Lakeshore Drive, and 20% of Mitchell Investments converted to a purely financial interest with no management rights or responsibilities." Richard's expression hardened. "That's excessive by any standard, even considering our 30 years together." "It's significantly less than I could claim if I invoked the infidelity clause," I pointed out. "Consider it a compromise that allows you to maintain the privacy of your business arrangements while providing me with the resources to truly establish independence." "And Vanessa?" Richard asked, his tone carefully neutral. "How does she factor Into these terms? The question caught me off guard. In all my planning and strategic positioning, I had focused on securing my financial future, not on the personal entanglements that had triggered this situation. Vanessa is free to make her own choices, I said finally. As am I. As are you. My terms relate strictly to the dissolution of our marriage, not to whatever relationship you choose to pursue afterward. Richard studied me, reassessing the woman, sitting across from him just as I had been reassessing myself in recent weeks. You've changed, he observed, an unfamiliar note in his voice, something like respect, or perhaps simple recognition of a truth long overlooked. No, I corrected gently. I've remembered. There's a difference. After 3 hours of negotiation, with both Martin and Patricia Hernandez, summoned by Richard midway through our discussion, contributing to the technical details, we reached an agreement that satisfied my core requirements. I would receive the Naples property outright, a 50% interest in the apartment building, and a 15% stake in Mitchell Investments converted to preferred shares with guaranteed dividends but no voting rights. More importantly, I secured complete freedom to establish myself wherever and however I chose, with no obligations to maintain connections to Richard's social or business circles. The financial resources to build a new life entirely on my terms. As I left Richard's study that day, I felt a weight lifting. Not just the immediate stress of the negotiation, but the accumulated burden of 3 decades spent conforming to someone else's expectations and requirements. For the first time since I was 22, my future was entirely my own to determine. Vanessa was waiting in the hallway, her face anxious as I emerged from Richard's study. She had maintained a careful distance in recent weeks, our few interactions limited to awkward encounters in shared spaces of the home we still both occupied. "Marlo," she began, her voice carrying a hesitancy unusual for my typically confident sister. "Can we talk? Please?" I considered refusing, walking past her as I had during other recent encounters. But something, perhaps the clarity achieved, during my negotiation with Richard, or simply emotional exhaustion, made me nod instead. "Not here," I said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I need coffee after that discussion." In the kitchen, I busied myself with the elaborate espresso machine. Richard had insisted on installing years earlier, a device I had mastered while he continued to struggle with its complexity. The familiar routine, measuring beans, adjusting settings, monitoring pressure, gave me something to focus on besides my sister's nervous presence. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Vanessa said abruptly. "Moving out, I mean. I've found an apartment downtown." I nodded, unsurprised. With the divorce proceedings formalized, maintaining our awkward cohabitation made little sense. "That seems wise," I replied, handing her a cup of the coffee I had prepared. "A fresh start for everyone." Vanessa accepted the cup, her fingers trembling slightly. "Is that what you're doing? Starting fresh?" "Yes," I said simply, "though not in Chicago. I'll be relocating once the divorce is finalized." Her eyes widened slightly. "Where?" "Seattle," I answered, the word carrying a newfound excitement each time I spoke it. "I'm going to open that gallery I planned before I met Richard." "Better." 3 decades late than never, I suppose. Vanessa stared into her coffee cup, avoiding my gaze. "I'm sorry, Marlo. For everything. For the betrayal. For the pain we caused you. It wasn't about hurting you. It just happened." It was the apology she had attempted to offer weeks earlier, the one I had been too angry and hurt to truly hear. Now, with the practical matters of separation largely resolved and my path forward becoming clearer, I could look at her, at us, with greater clarity. "Nothing just happens, Vanessa," I said quietly. "We make choices, hundreds of them, that lead us to particular moments and actions. You and Richard chose to pursue each other despite knowing the pain it would cause me. That's a reality neither of you can escape through passive phrasing. She flinched at the directness of my assessment, but nodded. You're right. We made choices, terrible, selfish choices, and you're the one who suffered for them. The simple acknowledgement, without justification or excuses, loosened something in my chest, a knot of anger I had been carrying since discovering their betrayal. Thank you for saying that, I said, surprising us both with the sincerity in my voice. It matters, even if it doesn't change anything. Vanessa looked up, hope flickering across her features. Can you ever forgive me? Not now, maybe not soon, but someday? It was the question I had been avoiding in all my planning and preparation for my new life. Could I ever move past this fundamental betrayal from the two people who should have been most loyal to me? Did I even want to try? I don't know, I answered honestly. Forgiveness isn't something I can promise or withhold like a transaction. It's a process, one I'm nowhere near completing. She nodded, accepting this uncertain answer with more grace than I had expected. I understand. But I want you to know that whatever happens between me and Richard, whether it lasts or falls apart, I will always regret the way it began. The person I hurt most is the person who has always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. As she rose to leave, I found myself speaking without having planned the words. Vanessa? I hope you find whatever it is you've been looking for all these years, the thing that will finally help you feel complete. Her eyes filled with tears. That's the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a long time, especially after what I've done. It's not kindness, I clarified. It's recognition that your restlessness, your constant searching, it comes from something unresolved within you, something no relationship or career or location can fix. I hope you find the courage to face that, whatever it is. After she left, I remained in the kitchen, finishing my coffee and contemplating the strange turn my life had taken. At 52, I was dismantling everything familiar to build something entirely new, something solely mine. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 6 months later, I stood in an empty storefront in Seattle's Pike Place. Market area, rain tapping gently against the windows that overlooked Elliott Bay. The space was smaller than I had initially envisioned, the floors uneven with age, the lighting in need of significant upgrading. It was perfect. I had signed the lease that morning, the first concrete step toward establishing Gallery Winters, specializing in emerging artists whose work might otherwise be overlooked by larger commercial galleries. My modest apartment a few blocks away was still half filled with unpacked boxes, but this space, this dream I had deferred for 30 years, had taken priority. What do you think? I asked Diane, who had flown out to help me settle into my new city. Can you see it? She turned slowly, taking in the empty walls and scarred floors, but seeing beyond them to the potential I had described. Absolutely. It's going to be magnificent, Marlo. Exactly what you always wanted. My phone buzzed with a text message. Martin, confirming that the final divorce papers had been filed and approved. Richard and I were officially no longer married after 30 years, 2 months, and 14 days. I should have felt something momentous, grief or relief or some combination of complex emotions. Instead, I felt only a quiet sense of completion, of one chapter ending as another began. It's done, I told Diane, showing her the message. Officially divorced. She squeezed my hand. How does it feel? I considered the question seriously, looking out at the gray waters of Puget Sound, so different from the familiar shores of Lake Michigan. Like freedom, I said finally. Like I can breathe fully for the first time in decades. As we left the gallery space, my gallery space, I paused to lock the door, the key still unfamiliar in my hand. Behind me, Seattle continued its everyday rhythm, water dripping from awnings, ferries crossing the Sound, people hurrying through afternoon errands beneath colorful umbrellas. None of them knew me as Mrs. Richard Mitchell, the perfect corporate. wife from Chicago's North Shore. Here, I was simply Marlo Winters, gallery owner, new resident, woman starting over. The name on the lease, on my bank accounts, on all the paperwork establishing my new life, was the one I had been born with, reclaimed like so many other aspects of myself during these months of transformation. Not a return to who I had been at 22. That woman was long gone, shaped by experiences both challenging and enriching during my years with Richard. Instead, I had become someone new yet familiar, a woman who carried wisdom earned through 3 decades of compromise without being defined by it. A woman who had discovered, through the painful dissolution of her marriage, a strength and resilience she had only glimpsed previously. "Ready for dinner?" Diane asked, linking her arm through mine as we walked toward the restaurant we had selected to celebrate this milestone day. "I hear this place makes an incredible seafood risotto." "Ready," I confirmed, smiling as rain misted my face. "For dinner, for tomorrow, for whatever comes next." The prenup that Richard had insisted upon 30 years earlier, the document, designed to protect his assets from my potential claims, had become the unexpected key to my liberation. Its specific clause addressing infidelity with a family member had given me the leverage to negotiate terms that supported genuine independence, rather than the illusion of generosity Richard had initially offered. But the true revelation wasn't in the financial settlement or the properties transferred to my name. It was in discovering that beneath the careful performance of Mrs. Richard Mitchell still lived a woman with dreams and ambitions of her own. A woman capable of rebuilding her life at 52 with the same determination she had once applied to supporting someone else's vision. As Diane and I settled at our table, glasses of Washington State wine before us, I proposed a toast. "To unexpected beginnings," I said, raising my glass. "And to the woman who was strong enough to embrace them," Diane added, clinking her glass against mine. Outside, Seattle continued its gentle rain, washing everything clean, preparing the ground for new growth. I couldn't have asked for a more perfect metaphor for the life I was claiming, one choice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.